For strangers have risen up against me, and violent men have sought after my soul. They have not set God before them. Behold, God is my helper. The Lord is of those who uphold my soul. He will requite the evil to my enemies, destroy them in your truth. With a freewill offering will I sacrifice to you. I will give thanks to your name, O Yahweh, for it is good. For he has delivered me out of all trouble, and my eye has seen its desire upon my enemies. Only 7 verses, but what is this psalm about? It is indeed a prayer to God. Yeah, a specific kind of prayer for a particular thing. Right? It's not merely a psalm of praise, just simply praising God for who he is or what he has done. It is a prayer for salvation from enemies. In fact, it takes on what we've kind of talked about in the past as being the standard lament form, but in a very abbreviated fashion. I mean, it's a very short psalm relative to a lot of the other ones. Not the shortest of them all by any means, but it still has, and I put that comment farther. Well, all right. Well, we'll do this a little out of order. The psalm itself has the standard things in it that you would expect from a psalm of lament. It has the description of the problem or the cause of sorrow at the beginning, right? The enemies. It has the confidence expressed in the middle that God will in fact act and move to save him. And then it has the kind of anticipation or the prediction of the praise that is to come. A praise that is done in a sort of anticipatory form. Right? Because the psalmist is confident, in fact, that God will act, he can anticipate the praise that he will give for that action after the action has taken place. And this is kind of the more, standard is a difficult word to use with psalms because they are also individual in many ways. But this is kind of that basic form. And it gets all done within a short space of only 7 verses. We have a couple verses talking about the problem, a couple verses talking about the confidence in the solution, and then just another couple more, or 2 or 3 at the end talking about that praise. The only information that gives us specificity, I can say the word, about what this is about, though, is actually in the superscription, right? The preamble to the psalm. There's nothing in the psalm that says anything specifically about the Ziphites, about David, about Saul, about a specific circumstance. So you'll see, if you do research and read commentaries, some people argue that this must have been added later, or maybe they don't necessarily have anything to do with one another, right? That someone was assuming that this is what David was writing about, but again, they're just making inferences as well, and there's no way to prove themselves correct in that regard either. But taking that superscription for a minute, Ziph is a town, a small town apparently, that was a little bit south of Hebron, which is itself south of Jerusalem. It's in the kind of hill country above the Dead Sea, on the western side of the Dead Sea. And this is the specific place. This actually does refer to specific events that are described in the Bible. Yes, good. It was my next note. This happens to David twice, in fact. It's recounted in 1 Samuel 23 and in 1 Samuel 26 that David has gone into hiding, trying to escape from Saul. And the people of that area, the men of Ziph, go to Saul and tell him that David is in fact hiding there, and then Saul comes down from Jerusalem to pursue David. And having done this once, as described in 1 Samuel 23, David returns and they do it again. And Saul comes after him once more. And so if we were to associate this psalm, as indicated in that superscription, with this event, it could fit either one of those, really. So it's kind of difficult to say if it was the first or the second or what have you. But this is an event that happened to David on multiple occasions, even down to the very specific place. The very first time Saul is unsuccessful, he has actually surrounded David, according to the text, and it looks like he's closing in, but a messenger comes to tell him that the Philistines are raiding Israel, and he has to leave with his army to go deal with that, and David escapes. The second time is the famous story that you've probably seen on a flannel graph as a child, where David is able to sneak up on Saul with one of his men while Saul is sleeping. The man offers to kill Saul, right? Solve David's problem here with one stroke. David says, no, we're not allowed to do that. Instead, they take his spear and jug of water, his skin of water, and they leave with that. And the following day, they have a conversation from a distance where David points out that he could have, in fact, had he any malice towards Saul, he could have killed him, but he chose not to, because he does not view Saul as his enemy in that way, not someone for whom it is licit to raise his hand. Right? He cannot oppose Saul in that way. And then Saul, recognizing this justice, recognizing this mercy, then abandons his pursuit, at least at that point. Were the men of Ziph right or wrong to tell Saul where David was?
Well, if you want to keep in good graces with the king, and somebody's there, in another story, the whole priest get killed because of not speaking up.
Yeah, we talked about this.
Deceptively hiding.
The previous psalm, right, the prior psalm, talking about the occasion where, when they did not, even in their own ignorance, they did not try to turn in David, not knowing that he was on the run from Saul. They suffered the slaughter of their entire town because Saul was angry about it. So it may certainly have been prudent in a practical sense. But leaving aside practicality for the moment, I mean, we are in a Bible class. Morally, what is the correct course of action here? Is it better to tell Saul? They are men of Judah. They're part of the tribe of Judah. Saul is the king.
Was it Rahab that lied to the people to say he wasn't there?
This is true. Rahab lies to the people of Jericho when they spy out the city before its destruction. I have thoughts about that too. But we won't get into that. We're going to leave that to one side. But that's true. It's an example. Yes, ma'am.
We are looking at it from seeing the whole story before and after.
Mm-hmm.
The Ziphites were called, you know, they weren't as enlightened about what was really going on.
Perhaps that's certainly true to a degree, right? To exactly what degree, we don't know how much they knew. We know more than they do, right? We see the whole sweep of history that follows from this, right? David, in fact, is the one from whom the Messiah descends. I don't know that the Ziphites necessarily knew that much, at least, about him, right? And how much they knew in the moment is certainly a question that we could talk about. Yeah. Yeah.
So David refused to strike Saul down, and that's different from telling Saul where David is, but isn't Saul still divinely appointed at this point?
He is. He is the anointed king of Israel. And David seems to make that case, yeah, that is not something that you can just ignore or that it expires or goes away. He remains the anointed king as long as he lives. There's an extended conversation in 26 between him and the man with him when they sneak into the camp, where David points this out. He says, it may be indeed that God is going to strike him down in some other way. You may go into battle and fall in battle, but it is not my place to do something about this. Yeah. Yeah.
And in another sense, the moral question, the king has declared that Saul is against him or done something wrong. So the kind of the word out there is that he's against the king or against Israel, needs to be apprehended and brought to justice.
Right. He has made David an outlaw. Yeah. 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 We'll revisit this in a moment. I have a little bit more about this, but we'll do that. Here's my note that's out of place apparently about the lament format, so we'll skip past that. The psalmist in the first verse invokes the name of God to save him. How does a name save someone?
When you're thinking about God, giving him a name indicates that you believe he exists.
Okay. Sure. I mean, it was certainly not a problem with the people of Israel to believe that God was real, that God was truly there. Yes, sir.
It points to the authority of God.
Okay, it speaks to his authority. Yeah. We do things in the name of someone else, right? You hear this in maybe more old-timey movies that, and I always wonder about this because if they're already willing to break the law, shouting at someone to stop in the name of the law doesn't seem to me to be effective. But the phrase itself points to what you're trying to say. You're saying that in the authority or based on this name that I can invoke, you should behave in a particular way. Yeah. We can see names as having power. The name of someone, too, was understood to be an element of who they were, as their character, as their nature, right? That by the very nature of who God is, the psalmist then has an expectation that God will behave in a particular way. Which is a good understanding of who God is, right? That because God is a good God, because you are just, because you are loving towards your people, I expect then that you will then behave this way. I am asking you to be consistent with your nature, right? And it's less that the actual invocation of God's name will have some effect, right? That simply by saying it, something will happen, but that he is saying, because I know who you are, I expect that you will do certain things, right? That we have a knowledge of God's nature, and by that knowledge of his nature, we can then have some knowledge of what he will do. We don't fully understand him, we don't fully understand his motives and his ways, but we can know his ends. God is good, God is loving, God is just. And we can expect the outcomes of his actions to be with those ends in mind. Yeah?
So in the New Testament, it tells us not to swear by the name of God or by the throne or by heaven, because we don't own those. That's not ours authority to invoke or to call upon. But in this case, he's using it rightly. He's saying, not by my authority, I'm asking you, by your authority, God, to do this, which is really cool the way he presents it.
Yeah, we can almost read this as saying, because you are who you are, God, I am asking you, knowing that you have certain things in mind that you want, that you choose, because you have told us this about yourself. Yeah. So the name itself is a kind of a stand-in for the personality is the wrong word, the character of God, right? That those attributes of him that we do know. He asks then also to be vindicated or justified over and against his enemies. The next part of that verse is that he is to be, and it depends on your translation, vindicated or justified by your might. Right? That because of God's nature, right, he will have this satisfaction. Did I put a second? No, it does not. Well, I'm going to leave that for a later verse, actually. We're going to leave that here. Again, this goes to the idea of the name, though. Because of God's character, because of God's desire for justice, he can appeal for justice and expect to get that. And it is an example of the confidence that he has in his own cause, that he doesn't necessarily have to ask for a specific outcome beyond being saved, being vindicated, having justice. He's confident enough in his own case. But to hear him, does not God hear all things? Is God not everywhere? Right? This is another psalm. What is it? Psalm 139? It's a ways away, so I'm a little more fuzzy than perhaps I ought to be. But God is, everywhere we go, we cannot get away from him. Why does he ask God to hear him? Would God not hear him normally?
It seems like it's like a prayer. God knows what you need and he'll take care of you. But when you pray to him, you're speaking to him. You want him to listen to you specifically.
Yeah, we're asking for a specific sort of result. Yeah, there's a distinction maybe that we draw in English that is not always obvious from the words that we use. Right? Yeah.
It's kind of like a legal case. To the judge, you're saying, please hear my case. I'm begging petitioning you to answer me. That's kind of what I see him doing.
Sure. The official sense of hearing, right? That we use this, and that's a great example, that we use that term for our legal matters, right? That you want to receive a hearing.
Yeah.
It's not that they can't hear you if you go and you like bang on the door and shout. What it means is that they are taking official notice, right? That you have gained the official attention. And it is the difference sometimes, in a sense, maybe between hearing and listening, right? I can hear the noise, but I'm not listening to it. I can hear my children in the background, but I'm not really listening to them at the moment. It's just a dull roar. And that sense, that distinction between the attention and the inattention is really kind of, I think, what he's driving at. Yeah?
To me, it's more of a rise of your emotions, how much more you want him to hear. You get to pray, you pray hard, you pray lighter than that, just praying for your mother or your family or something like that. If you really want something to happen, you'll say, hear me, or even pray harder. So I believe it is a rise of emotion, maybe.
Sure.
He needs it more than other times, maybe.
Yeah, and it can also serve, that is that intensifier, right? That when someone is already listening to us, right? Even if we already have someone's attention, adding that phrase, right, that you really want to be heard, helps drive home maybe the desperateness of your position or the intense need that you have. That's very important.
Raises the other side's attention to really hear that person out, maybe.
Yeah, it is a push for them to really pay closer attention, right? Or an expression of your own need. Yeah. The strangers. He talks about strangers in verse 3. Strangers are attacking him or have risen up against him. The people of Ziph are from Judah. They're Israelites. Who are strangers? Is this about something else? Is this perhaps evidence for those that would argue that preamble was added later, tacking it on where it may not have entirely belonged? Yeah.
It could also mean like strangers, like non-believers of God.
Okay, this is getting very good. This is a good point, right? Strange in what sense, right? We think of strangers as people you don't know, right? People that I've not seen before. People with whom I am not familiar. But the word here in Hebrew actually takes on a slightly different connotation. This is the same word that is used in Leviticus 10 verse 1, where they go and they offer the strange fire before the Lord and are punished for this.
It's not appropriate.
It doesn't belong. And in Proverbs 5:3, referring to the strange or stranger who is a woman, the adulteress, it doesn't necessarily mean someone you don't know within the Hebrew context. It means that which is not suitable here. It doesn't fit. It's not the right one. And it goes into the next line that we have. Right? Strangers have risen up against me. Violent men have sought after my soul. They have not set God before them. They are opposed to the will of God. Right? They are people who do not belong here, who should not be doing this thing. They are not necessarily unknown to the writer, but they are people that are not in the place they ought to be, not doing the thing they ought to do. They are strangers in this sense. Again, it's not necessarily, when you read the word strange or stranger, something that is unfamiliar within the biblical context, but it is something that is unsuitable within the biblical context that it is talking about. So it's not necessarily that he didn't know who these men of Ziph were. This could easily also, I guess, have been about the second encounter, where he may have really known who it was that did it to him the first time, and they're doing it again, running off to tattle on him to the king. And then I had a note, which is, what I said. But then, all right, well, let's back up again. So let's talk more about these men of Ziph. Were they really violent men? Did they attack David? No, they just went and talked to the king. How are these people, if this is what we're to understand, right, the men of Ziph, how are they violent men?
My version says ruthless.
Ruthless, okay.
They're taking advantage of the situation, not following God's real plan for Israelites and their relationships with each other. Instead of standing between two brothers and bringing them together and helping them hear their case, they're just taking advantage of David, trying to get something from the king maybe, as turning him in as a reward for turning him in.
Sure,
Whatever.
sure.
There's other ways of being violent besides hitting or killing. Yeah.
Yeah. The thing I think of in this context is Saul who becomes Paul, right, in the New Testament. When Stephen is stoned, what does he do? Does he participate? Or does he stand by and just simply approve of what's going on and aid those that are doing it by holding their coats while they do it? There's ways of being involved in violence, exactly, that are not necessarily the direct participation. We recognize this in our own legal system, right? Do we not? Right? That you can be involved and be punished in the same way as someone who commits a murder if you're simply helping them to commit a murder. Or if it is done in service of a larger goal in which you are all participating. People who are committing armed robbery, that commit capital murder, everybody who was involved is now culpable because it was part of your whole plan or part of the whole endeavor. And so in this case, to lump in the men of Ziph with Saul and what he was trying to accomplish is a reasonable thing. Even if they themselves are not trying to be the hands that commit the violence, they are participating and helping and aiding Saul who seeks David's life. They're there going along, giving approval to his actions. Have they turned away from God? That's the next line after that. Violence? They have not set God before them. God is not in front of them. They have not put God before them. A locution, they of course don't move where God is, but meaning they have oriented their lives or pointed themselves in God's direction, in God's way. They have turned away and followed other inclinations, other directions. Is that what's happening? Is not Saul, we talked about this, Saul's been anointed by God to be king. How have they turned away from God? Let's think about the situation a little bit. We'll flip it around. Saul has been anointed by God to be king. He is God's anointed. Therefore, it is wrong for any man to raise his hand against him. But what about David? What happened to David? Do you remember the story about Samuel coming to David's house? Jesse talking to his father, wanting to see his sons brought out. What does he do at the end of this story? He anoints David as king of Israel. David, no less than Saul, is the anointed king of Israel. He is not presently the king, but he has been anointed to be the king to succeed Saul. Saul has disobeyed God. God has told him that he will not continue on the throne. God sent his prophet to David, had him anointed. David is no less inviolate. Saul should not raise his hand against David. It is wrong. Just as David refuses in any way to turn against Saul and try and cause his death because of his status, Saul should have the same attitude towards David. And he doesn't. And so he and any who help him are turning away from God by trying to act against what God has decided. Saul's son recognizes this, Jonathan, and he understands David. Their friendship was very close, and they knew each other's minds. And Jonathan did not fear that David was going to assassinate his father. He knew that David was not a threat to Saul, that Saul's downfall was already promised by his own actions and God's judgment of them. And Jonathan, in allowing David to leave and helping him escape, is helping Saul. He is preventing Saul from committing a heinous crime by attacking and striking down the anointed one of God. His act was the loyal act. And everyone who is aligning themselves with Saul, even though he is the king, insofar as it means pursuing and attacking David, has turned against God. The psalmist is right here. If this is referring to this circumstance, that the Ziphites then have turned to violence, they have turned away from God, and they have raised their hand, figuratively speaking, against the anointed of God, and they are seeking to oppose the will of God. They have turned away. Yeah.
Everyone knew that David was the next anointed king?
I don't know how many people knew, but enough people should have known that it was the sort of thing that you should not do. Even, and I'll back that claim off even slightly, and I'll make the same case. What has David done to deserve death? Everyone knew who he was in relation to the king, even absent this thing. When we talked about the priests, I think it was last week, we talked about the fact that when David shows up and says that he needs things, they knew that he was Saul's right hand. That he was the one that went and struck down the enemies of the king, that acted on behalf of the king, that served the king. And of course they gave him what he asked for. And this was their plea to Saul when Saul came and rebuked them about it. How could we know that the man you have always trusted, who has always served you loyally and faithfully, was now somehow your enemy? We have not heard of him doing anything disloyal to you, anything criminal, anything deserving of death. In the same way that if the government decides to just pick on a person and punish them without cause, it would be wrong for any of us to support that. You can't just choose people at random and have them killed without cause, without breaking a law. It's ridiculous. And this same thing would have applied with the Ziphites as well. Even if they had no notion that David had been anointed, he was innocent. What had he done? Nothing. And so to pursue an innocent man, to aid in the capture and execution of an innocent man, is wrong. Is wrong. Yeah. They had turned away from the truth that God gives them in the law, right? That those who have not committed a crime cannot suffer a punishment. Sorry, I got a little bit on a soapbox there and ranted a moment. I beg your pardon. We see that this is true. And if we cast our minds back, then what they did, was it right or wrong when they go and tell the king where David is? It was the wrong thing to do. It was the wrong thing to do. They should not have gone to try and inform on David to the king. It places them in league with the men of violence. It places them in opposition to the Lord. Interestingly, the last line of 3 stops addressing God directly, and instead seems to be speaking to the congregation. He has been addressing God, speaking of his problem, asking for help. But then the line, they have not set God before them, appears to be addressed to the hearers of this psalm, rather than directly to God. God knows this, and he is not speaking to him, he is speaking of him. The next line in 4 follows this up, and it contrasts the two things. the psalmist says that, behold, though, God is my helper. They have turned against God, I have remained with God on my side. The word behold there is a great one. We don't have a real direct correlate in English. Behold is about as close as we get. It is like one of my favorite Anglo-Saxon words, one of the only Anglo-Saxon words I know, whet, right, which is used a lot in the famous poem of Beowulf, which is a word that is simply there to get the listener to really pay attention. It says, you need to really listen to what I'm about to say next. And that's what this word behold is. Right? He is trying to drive home this point to the listener. They have opposed God, but I am not. I am still remaining among those that serve him. God, he says, is among those who uphold his soul. Among. Who else upholds his soul?
Mine says, the Lord is the upholder of my life.
Yeah, the translations will do that. They'll make it the singular. In the original Hebrew, it is actually in the more in the plural sense, that he is one of those, or he is among them that.
So he's going for justice here, and he's saying, all those who do know the truth, who do seek justice, they uphold my soul. But it's referring to himself as well. He is lifting himself up, trying to be the right person before God, following justice himself.
I see what you're saying, and I don't think I don't think it's wrong, certainly that is the case, right? That David is one who is seeking after what is right and so forth. I think that the phrasing is a little bit different in terms of what he's intending with it, that I think that the singular translation does get at the idea of it in a way that is a little bit less confusing. We don't do this a lot in English, but we do it occasionally. You can speak of a group without necessarily having other members of a group in mind. As a way of maybe providing emphasis, or as a way of simply, providing almost a literary interest, right? As a poetic way of speaking about it. The only, and it's not great, but the best kind of example that I kind of thought of when I was trying to put this together was, it's like saying of someone else that he's one of the really good ones, but you're not really ever, not at that moment, thinking about someone else, right? If I was to say this about someone, he's one of my best friends, maybe I don't have a lot of other friends in mind at this point. The point I'm trying to make, though, is about who the person is and what their status is. And by using this plural, it gives the whole phrase a little bit of a different feeling to it. I don't know how to say it much better than that, and I apologize. But the sense that I got from researching or studying this, to the best of my limited abilities and lack of Hebrew, is that this is a way of expressing things that was sometimes used almost as a way of emphasis, without necessarily implying other members of that set. That God fills that group on his own. There's no one else in a more grand cosmic sense who holds us. There's no one else that can really do that. But by saying God is one of the ones that does that, it is a way of almost saying that unless you can find someone else that fits in that category, right, God is going to fill that up all by himself. That he will be the only one. But he's significant enough to warrant a pluralization, almost. Maybe the idea of the royal we kind of encompasses that too. That when you are significant enough, grand enough, powerful enough, the use of the plural pronoun in the way that monarchs do suits, right? Everybody knows, of course, the famous Queen Victoria line, right? We are not amused. Well, she's not talking about anybody else. She's talking about herself. But the we, the pluralization, is used as a way of demonstrating or speaking about her own nature, or who she was, or the role she holds. In a similar kind of way, maybe this is doing that with God. giving the plural, even though that God is the only one in the category. So, all right, I'm running out of time. 5 is confidence that God is going to destroy those that oppose him. I really want to get to this point. He is persuaded of the justice of his cause, right? That God's justice will vindicate. We've talked about this a little bit with other psalms where the psalmist is asking for the destruction of his enemies. And the expectation is that the destruction will come as part of God's justice. That he is confident in himself and his alignment with God's purposes, that by asking for justice to be done, that he will be justified and saved, and his enemies will be destroyed because of their opposition to God. Right? It is less about desiring that God would side with me than by saying, I'm sure that I have sided with God, and therefore his justice will then turn out to my benefit. We don't persuade God to join our cause and then have ourselves saved and justified. We instead align ourselves with God and are preserved and saved, justified, when his justice is meted out. And this will be my last point. There's a summation of this in a movie one of the greatest movies of all time, Man for All Seasons, where Thomas More is being interrogated, and he rebukes the man who is speaking to him, saying that he threatens like a dockside bully. And the man says very quickly back, well, then how should I threaten you? He says, you should threaten like a minister of state with justice. And he says, oh, it is justice that you're threatened with. And Thomas More sits back in his seat and says, well, then I am not threatened. And it is that same idea, that it is justice that you are trying to intimidate me with. I am confident that I am on the side of God, and true justice is no threat to me. And that is, I think, the position the psalmist is taking here when he is asking for that judgment to be visited. All right, I've definitely run long. I've seen small children in the back go through past the doorway. Any final thoughts, final comments, final questions? No time for complaints today, I'm afraid. All right, well, we will stop there. We will move on to 55 next week.